In 1968, a 2-day-old newborn baby boy was taken from the hospital in broad daylight by a woman disguised as a nurse, vanishing without a trace and plunging his parents into a desperate search that lasted for decades. 2 years later, an unidentified child was suddenly found in another state and brought home to live with the shattered family. But doubts about the boy's identity never truly disappeared, and the investigation ultimately reached a dead end. For more than 40 years, a man grew up under a name that may not have belonged to him, while other missing children and terrifying secrets remained buried in dusty files. Then in 2014, a DNA test that seemed only meant to answer a question about blood relations shattered the entire story everyone believed to be true, reopening a cold case nearly half a century old and leading investigators to shocking discoveries no one could have imagined. Before we dive deeper into this haunting story, let us know where you're watching from. And if you love cold case stories with secrets buried for decades, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Spring 1968 came to Cleveland, Ohio, with long stretches of rain and the low gray skies that often blanketed the industrial city on the shores of Lake Erie. Nestled amid a network of railroads, steel mills, and working-class neighborhoods sprawling across Cuyahoga County, Cleveland was then a bustling city where thousands of families depended on factories, ports, and production plants operating around the clock. On the streets around the hospital on the east side of the city, buses ran one after another along the wet pavement. Pedestrians hurried under dark umbrellas, and inside the buildings, life continued at the familiar rhythm of a midweek afternoon. The maternity ward on the 3rd floor of the hospital was a quiet place with long hallways, white-painted doors, and patient rooms where young mothers waited for the day they would bring their babies home. The Holloway family was no different from the other ordinary families there, and Margaret and Richard believed that in just one more day they would leave the hospital with their firstborn child. No one knew that afternoon would divide their lives into 2 parts that could never be the same again. Margaret Holloway lay propped up against a high pillow after a nearly sleepless night, her face pale from childbirth but her eyes unable to leave the bassinet beside the bed. Ethan James Holloway had been born less than 2 days earlier, with dark hair, small hands that often clenched tightly, and a plastic identification band wrapped around his wrist. Richard needed to go home to get clothes, insurance papers, and the cream-colored wool blanket his mother had knitted for Ethan. Before leaving, he leaned down to kiss his son's forehead and told Margaret, "I'll be back before dinner time." Margaret watched until the door closed. After Richard left, the maternity ward grew quieter, with only the sound of wheeled carts in the hallway, nurses' call bells, and the steady patter of rain against the window panes. Margaret had just closed her eyes for a few minutes when a woman around 30 years old entered wearing a white nurse's uniform, holding a clipboard, and with her brown hair neatly pinned back. She called Margaret by name, asked about her health, then walked over to the bassinet and called Ethan's name. The woman explained that the doctor needed to check the baby's heartbeat and reflexes again before finalizing discharge procedures the next morning. Margaret had no suspicions. The woman spoke calmly, knew the hospital procedures, leaned down to check the identification band on Ethan's wrist, and compared to the paper on her clipboard. Then she lifted the baby, placed him in the rolling bassinet, and pulled the blanket up to his chest. The last moment Margaret saw her son was when the woman pushed the bassinet out the door, turned her head, smiled, and said, "I'll bring him back in a few minutes." 15 minutes passed, then 30, but Ethan did not return. When nearly 40 minutes had gone by, Margaret rang the call bell for staff. A duty nurse came in, but her expression immediately changed when she heard Margaret ask about Ethan's checkup. "There is no checkup scheduled for this afternoon," she said. Margaret jumped up, dragging her IV line, and walked barefoot into the hallway, repeatedly asking everyone who passed by where her son was. Richard had just returned to the hospital when he saw his wife standing in the middle of the walkway, her face deathly pale and her hands shaking violently. "A nurse took Ethan," Margaret said, "but no one knows who she is." Hospital staff immediately searched the nursery, patient rooms, and nearby hallways, but Ethan was nowhere to be found. No staff member on duty matched Margaret's description, and no one had been authorized to take the child for a checkup that afternoon. Richard held his wife as her knees nearly gave out, and calls for Ethan began echoing throughout the maternity ward. When they realized their less than 2-day-old son had truly disappeared, Richard demanded the hospital call the police. At the end of the hallway, security shift supervisor Thomas Keegan picked up the phone, dialed the Cleveland Police Department, and reported that a newborn had just gone missing from the hospital. Less than 15 minutes after the call, at 4:47 p.m. on May 16, 1968, 2 Cleveland Police Department patrol cars stopped at the hospital's main entrance. Detective Frank Delaney, a 42-year-old investigator with the homicide unit, entered the maternity ward along with his younger partner, Detective Walter Briggs. The entrances had been temporarily locked by security shift supervisor Thomas Keegan, but Delaney understood that the lockdown had occurred nearly 40 minutes after Ethan was last seen. If that woman wanted to get out of here, she had plenty of time, he told Briggs before ordering patients, visitors, and all staff to remain in place for statements. Margaret Holloway was taken back to room through 312. She was still wearing her hospital gown, barefoot, and kept asking the police if they thought Ethan was still in the building. Delaney sat down in front of her and opened his notebook. "Mrs. Holloway, I need you to tell me everything, even details you think are unimportant." Margaret described a white woman around 30 years old, with light brown hair neatly pinned back, about 5 feet 6 inches tall, wearing a white nurse's uniform and speaking in a quiet but firm voice. The woman had carried a clipboard, called Margaret by name, knew Ethan was less than 2 days old, and knew the family was scheduled to be discharged the next morning. "She checked Ethan's wristband," Margaret said, her voice trembling. "I thought anyone who knew those things must work here." While Delaney took the statement, Briggs directed the search of the hospital. Police checked every patient room, bathroom, supply closet, laundry room, stairwells, and service elevators. Laundry carts were held, and every bin of dirty linens was opened. By 5:25 p.m., there was no sign of Ethan. Nursing supervisor Helen Ward confirmed that no uniforms were missing and no staff member on duty matched Margaret's description. Delaney immediately noted in his notebook, the suspect had prepared the uniform before arriving at the hospital. The first lead came from James Collins, 56, a janitor working on the 3rd floor. Collins said that around 4:05 p.m. he saw a woman in a white uniform pushing a bassinet toward the service elevator. "I thought it was strange because the nursery is in the opposite direction," he said. Delaney asked why he hadn't stopped her. Collins was silent for a few seconds, then replied, "Because she looked like a nurse. No one thinks a nurse is kidnapping a baby." A laundry worker named Dorothy Mills added that about 10 minutes later, she saw a woman with similar features walking through the 1st floor carrying a dark green cloth bag. Dorothy clearly remembered one thing. The woman was not in a hurry. She walked steadily, looked straight ahead, and disappeared down the hallway leading to the loading dock area. In 1968, the hospital had no surveillance camera system, so Collins and Dorothy's statements were the only traces of the route the suspect used. By 6:10 p.m., Delaney began checking the list of doctors and staff present in the maternity area. One name that stood out was Dr. Harold Pierce, 34, a resident physician who had been on the 3rd floor earlier that afternoon. Pierce said that from 3:50 to 4:40 p.m., he had been performing a procedure on the 2nd floor. Duty logs and statements from Dr. Leonard Hayes and Nurse Carol Benton confirmed he was there. "Do you know any woman named Elaine Porter?" Delaney asked, after seeing the name in the list of former patients at the clinic where Pierce had worked. Harold paused briefly, then answered, "I met her a few times, nothing memorable. There was no evidence to hold him." In room 312, Richard Holloway was asked to write a list of everyone who knew Margaret had given birth, her room number, and the scheduled discharge time. Richard listed both sets of parents, 4 friends, co-workers at the machine shop, and 2 neighboring families. "None of them would want to take my son," he said. Delaney did not reply. He had already begun to suspect the kidnapper had not chosen Ethan at random. The woman knew the child's name, the discharge schedule, and how to use the service elevator without drawing attention. Around 7:20 p.m., as police prepared to expand the search outside the hospital, receiving dock worker Robert Gaines approached Delaney. Gaines said that around 4:20 p.m., he saw a dark-colored sedan leaving the service parking lot behind the building. "Did you see the driver?" Delaney asked. Gaines nodded. "A woman. I didn't see her face, but she was wearing light-colored clothing." "License plate?" Gaines shook his head. "I don't remember." Delaney looked at his watch and asked the final question. "How long before the hospital was locked down did the car leave?" Gaines thought for a few seconds. "About 20 minutes. Delaney closed his notebook. If that statement was accurate, by the time police received the report, Ethan Holloway had already left the hospital long ago. That very night of May 16, 1968, Detective Frank Delaney sent a preliminary report to the FBI office in Cleveland after the statements about the dark sedan raised the possibility that Ethan Holloway had been taken out of the city or even out of Ohio. Before midnight, state police received requests to set up temporary checkpoints on Interstate 71, Interstate 77, and major routes heading toward Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Indiana. Officers were given the description of the light brown-haired woman along with information about the less than 2-day-old baby. But the lack of a license plate or specific car model meant hundreds of sedans had to be checked in vain. Walter Briggs led a team of officers to the Greyhound bus station, Cleveland Hopkins Airport, and parking lots around the hospital, while railroad police checked trains leaving the city that afternoon. Passenger lists were reviewed. Ticket sellers were asked about women traveling alone with newborns, but no one remembered a case clearly enough to become a lead. On the morning of May 17, Ethan's photo and a composite sketch of the suspect, drawn by a police artist from Margaret's description, appeared on the front pages of local newspapers. Television stations WKYC and WDUB continuously broadcast the missing person alert, asking anyone who had been near the hospital between 3:30 and 4:30 p.m. the previous day to contact police. By 10 a.m., Richard and Margaret appeared before reporters in a small hospital room. Margaret was still wearing a coat over her hospital gown, her face pale from lack of sleep. Richard sat close to his wife and held her hand under the table. When a reporter asked what she wanted to say to the person holding Ethan, Margaret looked straight into the camera. "Please leave my child in a safe place," she said, her voice hoarse. "A church, a hospital, or a police station is fine. We won't ask any questions. Just don't hurt the little boy." The plea was replayed many times that day and quickly pushed the search beyond Cleveland's boundaries. The FBI sent alerts to hospitals, maternity clinics, child welfare agencies, and police departments in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Indiana, West Virginia, and New York. The Cleveland Post Office also asked employees to watch for families that suddenly had a newborn, even though the woman in the house showed no prior signs of pregnancy. Delaney divided investigators into teams to check records of women who had recently lost a child, claimed pregnancy but did not give birth, had a history of trying to buy newborns, or had previously been investigated for child abduction. In the first 3 days, more than 100 addresses were verified. Ethan was nowhere. On the afternoon of May 18, a taxi driver reported seeing a white baby blanket near the Greyhound station on Chester Avenue. The area was immediately sealed off. Richard and Margaret were brought in to identify the evidence. When the paper bag was opened, Margaret looked at the blanket for a few seconds, then burst into tears. "It's not Ethan's," she said. "My son's blanket had a blue border." The relief that the evidence did not belong to Ethan was quickly replaced by despair as the search returned to square one. 2 days later, police detained a woman at Cleveland Hopkins Airport after airline staff noticed her holding a newborn, but without a birth certificate. Briggs personally questioned the woman for nearly an hour. The child was ultimately identified as her grandchild, and the baby's mother was being treated at a hospital in Akron. By the end of the first week, the police tip line had received more than 700 calls. A man in Lakewood claimed his neighbor had just had a baby, despite not being pregnant. A motel owner in Euclid reported a woman who rented a room with a newborn and left before dawn. A truck driver said he had seen a dark sedan heading toward Pennsylvania. All were checked, but either unrelated or based on descriptions too vague to verify. Delaney began to understand that public attention was both an advantage and a burden. With every hour that passed, dozens more tips appeared, forcing investigators to spread resources thin while having no way to determine which information was real. Into the second week, the search expanded to Parma, Lakewood, Euclid, Shaker Heights, and other more distant neighborhoods in Cuyahoga County. Roadside motels were checked. Landlords were asked about women who had recently moved in with newborns. Social workers reviewed informal adoptions. Richard began joining volunteer groups, distributing flyers, returning home after midnight, only to wake up before dawn. Margaret mostly stayed in the hospital a few more days due to her health not yet recovered. But she called Delaney many times each day to ask the same question. Has anyone seen Ethan yet? The answer was always no. The more police, federal agents, postal workers, doctors, and ordinary citizens joined, the deeper Ethan seemed to vanish amid a city looking in every direction. On the afternoon of May 24, Delaney returned to the office after checking a false tip in the eastern suburbs and found Briggs placing a thin file on his desk. "We might need to look at this person," Briggs said. The file came from an investigator reviewing the list of women who had lost children and had experience in medical environments. The name on the first page was Elaine Porter, 31 years old, who had worked as an assistant at a private clinic in Cleveland. According to the file, Elaine had lost a child at birth, had received short-term psychological treatment, and had left her apartment not long before the abduction. Delaney looked at the old address, employment history, and move-out date recorded on the paper. "Does anyone know where she is now?" he asked. Briggs shook his head. "Not yet, but there's something else. The clinic where Elaine used to work has a doctor we've already met." Delaney looked up. Briggs placed his finger on the bottom line of the personnel file. The name written there was Dr. Harold Pierce. In the final days of May 1968, detectives Frank Delaney and Walter Briggs focused on verifying the connection between Elaine Porter and Dr. Harold Pierce, but the investigative direction that seemed most important quickly lost momentum. Rental records, moving receipts, and statements from the former landlord showed that Elaine had left Cleveland on April 29, more than 2 weeks before Ethan disappeared. A gas station near Youngstown still had a receipt with her signature from the next day, leaving Delaney without grounds to prove Elaine had returned to the city. She was placed on the list for continued verification, but was temporarily no longer a priority suspect. When this lead cooled, police moved on to other names. The first was Patricia Monroe, 40 years old, a nurse who had worked at the hospital but was fired the previous year after multiple conflicts with management. Patricia had sent threatening letters to nursing supervisor Helen Ward, and her appearance somewhat matched Margaret's description. Delaney and Briggs went to Patricia's apartment, but they discovered she had been in Cincinnati since May 14 to care for her sister who had just undergone surgery. Hospital records, bus tickets, and statements from 6 people confirmed Patricia could not have been in Cleveland when Ethan was abducted. 2 days later, police received information about Linda Carver, a woman living in Parma who had lost her baby in the 8th month of pregnancy. Neighbors reported Linda had said the baby would be coming home soon and had bought baby clothes after being discharged. On the morning of May 29, Delaney and 3 officers searched the house on West 54th Street. In the spare bedroom, there was a new bassinet, baby bottles, and many baby clothes, but no Ethan. Linda broke down crying during questioning and explained that she still could not accept her child's death. Hospital records confirmed Linda's baby had died at birth and was buried at Holy Cross Cemetery. Delaney left the house with a heavy feeling, understanding that the investigation was dragging grieving people into a tragedy unrelated to them. In early June, the FBI forwarded another file about Dr. Martin Kessler, a private doctor in Akron who had been suspected of falsifying birth certificates in informal adoptions. Kessler was questioned for 6 hours. Police searched his clinic, bank accounts, and patient list, but found no connection to Ethan or the Holloway family. During the review of the network of private clinics, Harold Pierce's name appeared again. On June 7, Delaney called Harold to the police station for a second interview. "You used to work with Elaine Porter?" Delaney asked. Harold sat up straight and replied that Elaine was only an assistant at the clinic, where he had collaborated for a few months. "I met her a few times. We weren't close. Did you know she lost a child?" Harold was silent for a moment, then said he had heard others mention it. When Delaney asked if Harold had met Elaine after she left Cleveland, he denied it. The duty log on the day Ethan disappeared continued to protect Harold. From 3:50 to 4:40 p.m., he was recorded as being on the second floor with Dr. Leonard Hayes and Nurse Carol Benton. No one on the investigative team checked more deeply who had recorded the times in the log, or whether Harold had left the second floor for any short period. With no new evidence, he was allowed to leave. On June 12, nearly a month after the abduction, an unmarked envelope was delivered to the Holloway home. Richard opened the letter right at the kitchen table. Inside was only a single typed sheet of paper. "The child is being well cared for. Stop searching." Richard immediately called Delaney. Police seized the envelope and checked for fingerprints, paper, typewriter ink, and the postmark. There were no useful fingerprints. The paper was common stationery, and the letter had been mailed from a public mailbox in downtown Cleveland. Richard believed this was the first sign that Ethan was still alive. "The writer knows we're still looking," he told Delaney. "It could be the woman herself who has our son." Margaret saw the letter differently. "What if it's just someone who read the newspaper?" she asked her husband. "What if they just want to see us suffer more?" Richard grew angry, believing Margaret was giving up hope, while Margaret burst into tears and said she was only afraid that every time she hoped, she would lose Ethan all over again. In the following weeks, police continued checking cases of newborns, appearing under unusual circumstances in Toledo, Erie, Youngstown, and Pittsburgh. A family in Pennsylvania was investigated for suddenly having a baby boy without local birth records. A woman in Canton was followed after telling neighbors she had received a child from a relative. A couple in Akron was questioned about paying cash to an adoption broker. None of the cases were related to Ethan. As the leads kept failing, Delaney and Briggs returned to the question that had troubled them from the first hours. How did the woman know Margaret's name, Ethan's name, the room number, and the family's scheduled discharge time? "Someone told her," Briggs remarked in an early July meeting. Delaney looked at the hospital diagram on the wall. Or she had been here long enough to find out on her own. But the lists of staff, doctors, and visitors were too large, and the hospital did not have a tight enough entry-exit control system to identify every person. Richard grew increasingly impatient with the pace of the investigation. He copied addresses from tip calls, drove himself to Lakewood, Euclid, and Parma, and knocked on doors of houses where women were suspected of recently appearing with newborns. Twice police had to ask him to leave other people's homes. In an argument at the station, Delaney said, "You're scaring people and could ruin the very investigation to find your son." Richard slammed his hand on the table. "And what have you found?" The question silenced the room. Margaret went in the opposite direction. She stopped answering the phone, drew the curtains, and avoided going outside because she could not bear the pitying looks. Some people sent comforting letters, but there were also letters asking why a mother would hand her child over to a stranger. Margaret read them in silence and hid them. Between her and Richard, conversations grew shorter. Richard thought his wife was giving up, while Margaret felt her husband was using the search to escape the pain. Both blamed themselves, but neither had the strength to say it. By the end of the summer of 1968, the room prepared for Ethan remained untouched. The bassinet stood against the wall. Baby clothes were still folded in the drawers, and the cream-colored wool blanket Richard had brought to the hospital on the afternoon his son disappeared had never been used. Outside, on utility poles and store windows across Cleveland, the posters bearing Ethan's face began to fade under sun, rain, and time. By the end of 1968, more than 6 months had passed since the afternoon Ethan Holloway disappeared from the hospital in Cleveland. But detectives Frank Delaney and Walter Briggs still had not received any sign of where the child was. There was no ransom note, no body found, no witness who could positively identify the woman in the nurse's uniform, and the dark-colored sedan that left the service parking lot was never identified. The Cleveland police and the FBI had checked thousands of passengers at train stations, bus terminals, and airports, reviewed birth records at hundreds of hospitals and clinics in Ohio and neighboring states, but none of the cases led them to Ethan. The tip line that once received hundreds of calls per week now had days when it didn't ring at all. Most new tips came from people who saw a dark-haired child in a store, on a bus, or at a gas station and believed it might be Ethan. Delaney still ordered every case to be verified, but he understood that the chance of finding a real lead was diminishing with each passing month. Into early 1969, Cleveland newspapers no longer ran Ethan's photo on the front page. Murders, bank robberies, and social unrest in the city gradually took over. The abduction was only mentioned again on Ethan's first birthday and the one-year anniversary of his disappearance. Richard Holloway did not accept that silence. Every weekend, he brought new flyers to churches, gas stations, and grocery stores from Cleveland to Akron. He sent his son's photo to out-of-state police departments and called Delaney at least twice a week. "Anything new?" Richard always asked. The answers grew shorter. "Nothing yet, Richard." Margaret lived in the house on West 98th Street, as if time had stopped on May 16, 1968. Ethan's clothes were still folded in the drawers. Unused baby bottles sat in the kitchen cabinet. The bassinet remained placed against the wall in the small second-floor room. When Richard suggested putting them away to avoid dust, Margaret only said, "If Ethan comes home, he'll need them." Richard did not bring it up again. While the Holloway family continued to wait, two names that had once appeared in the investigation files gradually disappeared from Cleveland. In February 1969, Dr. Harold Pierce left Ohio and took a job at a private clinic in Knoxville, Tennessee. He told colleagues he wanted a better career opportunity in the South. The move was noted in the file but not considered suspicious because Harold had never officially become a suspect. Elaine Porter vanished even more completely. Her last known address was unoccupied, mail was returned, and her employment records had ended before the abduction. An administrative check showed that Elaine had used the name Elaine Foster when renting a house in another state, but that information sat in a civil file that was never forwarded to Ethan's investigative team. No one noticed that Harold Pierce and Elaine Porter had left Cleveland within a relatively close time frame, and no one placed the two names side by side after Harold's interview in June 1968. By the summer of 1969, Delaney was assigned two more homicides and another missing persons case. Briggs transferred to the armed robbery unit. Ethan's file remained in the homicide unit, but the hours devoted to it gradually decreased. The maps once covered with pins were taken down. The document boxes were moved into filing cabinets. Delaney still kept a photo of Ethan in his desk drawer, but many weeks passed without him having a reason to open the file. On May 16, 1970, exactly 2 years after the abduction, Richard went to the police station. He was thinner, and gray strands had appeared in his hair even though he was just over 30. Delaney invited him into his office and closed the door. Richard asked if the police were still looking for Ethan. "The file is still open," Delaney replied. "I'm not asking about the file," Richard said. "I'm asking if you're still looking for my son." Delaney was silent for a long time. He had been a police officer for nearly 20 years and understood that some answers should not be given too easily. Finally, he placed both hands on the desk. "We have no new witnesses, no new evidence, and no locations left to search. I won't say we're giving up on Ethan, but right now, we don't have any realistic investigative leads." Richard looked at him and asked the question Delaney could not answer. "What if my son is still alive?" Delaney said nothing. That possibility was exactly what made the case so cruel. Ethan could have died within hours of being taken, but he could also be living in some house in Tennessee, Pennsylvania, New York, or anywhere in America, called by a different name and growing up without knowing Richard and Margaret Holloway existed. That evening, Richard returned home and found Margaret sitting in Ethan's room. She was holding a baby shirt that was now too small for a 2-year-old and asked her husband if, should Ethan still be alive, the boy would remember them. Richard stood in the doorway for a long time and then said, "He never had enough time to remember us." Neither said anything more. In the weeks that followed, the Holloway family's life continued in an endless wait. Then, on the morning of July 8, 1970, the phone in the house rang. Richard picked up. The caller was Special Agent Charles Whitmore from the FBI office in Cleveland. Whitmore said a boy, approximately 2 years old, had just been found abandoned in a stroller at South Hills Village, a shopping center in Bethel Park, Pennsylvania. The child had no papers, no identifiable parents, and an age that matched Ethan Holloway. Richard gripped the receiver tightly. "Are you saying this could be my son?" There was a second of silence on the other end before Whitmore answered, I'm saying we need you and Mrs. Holloway to come to Pennsylvania. On the morning of July 8, 1970, at South Hills Village in Bethel Park, Pennsylvania, security guard William Hargrove received a report about a child's stroller left near the entrance to the Joseph Horn Company department store. A sales clerk named Nancy Doyle said the stroller had been there for nearly 40 minutes with no adult returning. When Hargrove arrived, he saw a little boy sitting quietly in the stroller, wearing an old yellow shirt and brown shorts. The boy was about 2 years old, thinner than normal, with slightly sunken cheeks and a yellowish bruise around his left eye. There were no bags of clothes, birth certificate, letters, or any items to help identify him. Hargrove asked, "Where's your mom?" The boy looked at him, but did not answer. Bethel Park police were called at 10:18 a.m. Officer Raymond Cole searched the shopping center, restrooms, and parking lot and asked store employees if anyone had seen who brought the child. One woman remembered seeing a man in a brown jacket pushing the stroller into the shopping center around 9 o'clock, but another witness insisted the person with the boy was a woman. No one remembered a face, license plate, or the direction the person left. The child was taken to St. Clair Memorial Hospital for a medical check. Dr. Benjamin Walsh determined he was between 2 and 3 years old, mildly malnourished but without life-threatening injuries. The bruise around his eye had appeared several days earlier, and there were also some older bruises on his arms and back that made the doctor suspect neglect or abuse. When nurses asked his name, the boy stayed silent. They tried asking about his father, mother, and where he lived, but received no clear answers. He only repeated a sound that sounded like Lily or Lily whenever he became frightened. Because his identity could not be determined, child welfare staff temporarily named him Samuel Reed before transferring the file to Allegheny County Child Services. That afternoon, information about Samuel was sent to the FBI to cross-check against the National Missing Children list. Special Agent Charles Whitmore at the Cleveland office noticed that the boy's estimated age closely matched Ethan Holloway, the child abducted from the hospital more than 2 years earlier. Ethan's file was retrieved from storage and sent to Pennsylvania. On July 9, Detective Frank Delaney and Whitmore were at St. Clair Memorial Hospital. Doctors measured height, weight, head circumference, checked teeth, ear shape, and bone structure of Samuel, and compared them with the limited data remaining in Ethan's newborn records. The results could not confirm the two children were the same person, but they also did not rule out the possibility. Blood type testing showed Samuel had a blood type that could occur in a child of Richard and Margaret. In 1970, DNA testing did not exist, so experts could only rely on blood type, physical features, bone structure, and the photos taken of Ethan in his first less than 2 days of life. Dr. Walsh told Delaney that identifying a 2-year-old based on newborn photos was extremely difficult. Some facial features change over time, especially if the child had been malnourished. However, the shape of Samuel's left ear had a curve somewhat similar to Ethan's in the hospital photo. That detail was enough for the FBI to contact the Holloway family. On the afternoon of July 10, Richard and Margaret arrived in Pennsylvania with Delaney. Before they met Samuel, Whitmore took the couple into a small hospital room. "I need you both to understand," he said. "We do not yet have evidence proving this boy is Ethan." Margaret immediately asked, "But there's also no evidence saying he isn't, right?" Whitmore was silent for a few seconds, then nodded. Richard asked about the differences. Delaney explained that Samuel's age was only an estimate, his height was lower than what Ethan might have reached, and some facial proportions did not fully match the newborn photos. "If you two walk in there," Delaney said, "don't try to make the boy recognize you. Let the reaction happen naturally." Margaret did not reply. When the door to the children's room opened, she saw Samuel standing alone by the window, wearing a green sweater provided by the hospital and holding an old stuffed bear. In that moment, all the police warnings seemed to disappear. Margaret stood motionless, her hands rising to cover her mouth. "Ethan," she called very softly. The boy turned around. Richard looked at Samuel's face and immediately noticed the things that made him uneasy. The boy's chin was narrower than in the images he had held in his mind for 2 years. The ears were not entirely like Ethan's photo, and the eyes were a lighter brown than he remembered. Richard looked at Delaney but said nothing. He saw Margaret moving forward and understood he did not have the strength to shatter the hope that had just come back to life in her. Samuel did not run to them or call them Mom and Dad. He just stood still and looked at Margaret for a long time. The room was so quiet the wall clock could be heard. Margaret knelt a few steps away. "Do you remember, Mommy?" she asked. Samuel did not answer. He looked at her face, then at Richard standing behind her. After nearly a minute, Samuel let go of the stuffed bear, walked slowly toward Margaret, and reached out a small hand. Margaret took that hand and burst into tears. A nurse turned away to wipe her eyes, while Delaney and Whitmore stood silently at the back of the room. Richard still said nothing. Margaret pulled the boy into her arms, holding him tightly, as if afraid that letting go would make the child disappear again. Samuel did not resist. He rested his head on her shoulder. Margaret closed her eyes, stroked the boy's hair, and whispered into his ear a name she had called in her dreams for more than 2 years. Ethan. In the 2 days after that first meeting at St. Clair Memorial Hospital, Richard and Margaret Holloway faced a decision that no doctor or investigator could make for them. On July 12, 1970, Allegheny County child welfare worker Evelyn Parker met with the couple along with Detective Frank Delaney and Special Agent Charles Whitmore to explain that there was no scientific evidence strong enough to confirm that Samuel Reed was Ethan Holloway. If the family did not agree to take him in, the boy would be transferred to a county children's care facility while police continued searching for relatives. "We cannot say this is your son," Parker said, "but we also don't know who the boy belongs to." Richard asked if they could wait a few more months to continue checking. Parker shook her head. "The boy needs a place to live in the meantime." Margaret had sat silently throughout the meeting and only spoke up then. "What if the boy isn't Ethan?" Whitmore replied that this was a possibility they had to accept. Margaret looked through the glass window toward Samuel playing alone in the next room and said, "Then out there my real son is still missing, and in here is a child no one has come for. I can't leave both of them." Richard did not answer right away. That night, he spoke privately with Delaney and said he still noticed differences between Samuel and Ethan's photos. Delaney did not deny it. "If you bring the boy home, that doesn't turn doubts into truth," he said. Richard looked at him. "I'll bring the boy home, but I want Ethan's file to stay open." Delaney agreed. On July 15, temporary guardianship procedures were completed. Samuel Reed left Pennsylvania with Richard and Margaret. On the drive back to Cleveland, Margaret sat in the back seat, holding the boy in her arms and calling him Ethan. Samuel rarely responded to that name, but doctors said a child who had been abandoned and traumatized might need a lot of time to adjust. News of the Holloway family bringing the child home quickly appeared in the press. The next morning, the Plain Dealer ran a photo of Margaret holding Samuel as they stepped out of the car with the headline about the missing child returning after more than 2 years. Television stations called the event a miracle. Detective Delaney refused to confirm it officially. When reporters asked if police considered the case solved, he only said, "We do not yet have a method for absolute identification of the child." That statement appeared at the end of the news reports and was quickly overshadowed by images of Margaret hugging her son. At the house on West 98th Street, she opened the door to the room that had been kept exactly as it was since May 1968. The old bassinet was now too small for a child over 2, so Richard brought home a wooden toddler bed. Margaret placed the unused cream-colored wool blanket on it. She took out toys, baby clothes, and family photos from the cabinets, as if trying to connect the 2 lost years to the boy's life. Samuel stood in the middle of the room, looking around with no signs of recognition. Margaret handed him the stuffed bear Richard had bought before Ethan was born. "Do you remember it?" she asked. Samuel shook his head. Richard stood in the doorway and saw the fleeting disappointment on his wife's face. "The boy was still so small when he was taken," he said. "It's normal not to remember." Margaret nodded, as if she needed exactly those words to keep believing. In the weeks that followed, Samuel began to adapt to his new life. He ate more, gained weight, and became less afraid of strangers. Margaret took him to the doctor, bought new clothes, and spent almost all her time with him. Richard returned to the machine shop but sat for hours every evening watching the child play on the living room floor. He tried to find signs of Ethan in every gesture, the way he smiled, the way he held a spoon, the way he tilted his head when called by name. But the doubts never disappeared. On August 3, Richard went to see Delaney at the police station and asked for copies of the identification reports. He kept Dr. Benjamin Walsh's assessment of Samuel's estimated age, the ear-shape comparison chart, and notes that the boy's eye color did not fully match Ethan's newborn description. Richard stored it all in a locked file box in the basement. Margaret did not know about it. Another issue began appearing at night. Samuel often woke up around 2 or 3 in the morning, crying and calling out a sound like Lily. Margaret sat by the bed, held him, and asked who Lily was. The boy could not answer. Sometimes Samuel only repeated the name and pointed toward the door as if waiting for someone to come in. Richard told Delaney about this, but no missing child named Lily was connected to Samuel. It could be the name of someone who once cared for the boy, Delaney said, or just a word the boy learned. After a few months, the family stopped asking. Margaret did not want to keep searching a past that might pull Samuel away from her, and Richard feared every question would make the doubts grow larger. They also gradually stopped mentioning the possibility that the boy was not Ethan. In the Holloway home, silence became an unspoken agreement. Margaret called Samuel her son. Richard tried to learn to believe it. Samuel began turning his head when he heard the name Ethan. By early 1971, Richard's calls to Detective Delaney became less frequent. The abduction file remained unsolved, but no investigators were actively working on it. The document boxes were moved to the Cleveland Police Department's storage, sitting among hundreds of other old cases. No suspect was ever arrested. The woman in the nurse's uniform was never identified, and the real Ethan James Holloway was never proven to have come home. One late winter night, Margaret stood in the doorway of the room, watching the boy sleep under the cream-colored wool blanket. She softly called the name Ethan, and the child did not wake. In the basement, the reports Richard had kept still recorded the name Samuel Reed, along with the unexplained differences. Out there, another child might still be living under an unfamiliar identity. And in the room once prepared for Ethan Holloway, Samuel slept peacefully in another child's bed, under a name that had never truly belonged to him. Samuel Reed grew up in the house on West 98th Street under the name Ethan Holloway, and by the mid-1970s, most people who had known about the appearance of the unidentified child in Pennsylvania also began to believe that the Holloway family had truly found their son again. Margaret devoted almost all of the early years to making up for the time she believed Ethan had been stolen from her. She took him to school every morning, sat by his bed whenever he was sick, and kept every drawing, report card, and birthday photo in carefully dated boxes. For Margaret, the love for the child no longer depended on identification reports or police doubts. Richard also tried to be the best father he could. He taught Ethan to ride a bike, took him to watch the Cleveland Indians play at Municipal Stadium, and brought him to the machine shop on Saturday mornings. But there was always a distance between them that was hard to name. There were times when Richard looked at Ethan too long, as if searching his face for a feature he never saw. In the fall of 1978, when Ethan was 10, he went down to the basement looking for a baseball glove and discovered the metal box Richard had hidden behind some tool crates. Inside were dozens of yellowed newspaper articles. On the front page of the Plain Dealer from May 17, 1968, was a photo of a newborn with the headline about the abduction at the Cleveland hospital. Ethan read his own name under the photo. He continued opening the other documents and saw a photo of a little boy found at South Hills Village in 1970. Below that photo was a name he had never heard, Samuel Reed. That evening, Ethan placed the newspaper articles on the dining table. "Who is Samuel Reed?" he asked. Margaret stood motionless. Richard pulled out a chair and sat down, then said that Ethan had been abducted by a woman when he was only 2 days old and was found more than 2 years later in Pennsylvania. "So why did they call me Samuel?" Ethan asked. Richard explained it was only a temporary name because the police did not know who he was. Margaret took her son's hand. "We found you. That's what matters." Ethan wanted to believe that answer, but from that day on, he began to see his life differently. When filling out middle school enrollment forms, he realized his birth certificate was a reissued copy after returning to Cleveland. There were no dental records, medical records, or newborn footprints detailed enough to prove the child found in Pennsylvania was Ethan Holloway. Once, Ethan placed photos of himself at age 2 next to the photo of the newborn in the hospital. He looked at them for a long time, but did not feel he was looking at the same person. "Dad, are you sure I'm Ethan?" he asked Richard at age 16. Richard was silent and then answered, "You are our son." Ethan realized he had not answered the question. In the years that followed, fragmented memories began to disturb him. In some dreams, Ethan saw a dark room, 2 small beds, and the sound of a little girl crying on the other side of the door. Sometimes he woke up with the name Lily in his head. Margaret said he had called that name when he first came home, but no one knew who Lily was. After graduating high school in 1986, Ethan studied electrical trades at Cuyahoga Community College and then worked for an industrial maintenance company in Cleveland. In 1992, he married Laura Mitchell, an accountant, and later had 2 children. From the outside, Ethan had a stable life, a house in Parma, a steady job, a wife and children, and Sunday evenings returning for dinner with Richard and Margaret. But the feeling of living under someone else's identity never disappeared. Whenever a doctor asked about family medical history, Ethan had to answer based on Richard and Margaret's illnesses, even though he did not know if they were truly related to him. When his children asked who they took after in the family, he often stayed silent longer than necessary. In 1998, Ethan wrote to the Cleveland Police Department requesting to review the abduction file. He received some publicly available documents that still clearly stated the identity of the child found in Pennsylvania had never been confirmed by scientific methods. Ethan brought the file to meet Richard. "Did you know this the whole time?" he asked. Richard looked down at the table. "I knew there were doubts." "So why didn't you tell me?" Richard replied. "Because your mother lost a child. I didn't want her to lose another one." The two did not speak for nearly a month. They later reconciled, but the question of identity remained. Richard died of a heart attack in November 2003 at age 68, never knowing who Samuel Reed really was or where the real Ethan Holloway was. After the funeral, Margaret gave Ethan the file box Richard had kept for more than 30 years. Inside were the blood type comparison reports, ear structure reports, age estimates, and notes from Detective Frank Delaney. Ethan read them many times and put them away. In the early 2000s, DNA testing became more common, and he began thinking about testing his blood relationship with Margaret. But every time he mentioned it, she became silent. In 2007, when Ethan said a test could end all doubts, Margaret asked, "What if the result says you're not Ethan?" He did not answer. She looked at him for a long time and said, "I already lost a child once. I don't want to lose another one." Ethan continued to delay. In 2010, he researched testing labs. In 2012, he filled out an application form and deleted it before paying. He knew the truth could free him from decades of doubt, but it could also break the woman who had raised him since he was 2. By the fall of 2014, Ethan was 46 years old. One October night, after Margaret called to wish him a happy birthday on the date listed on his papers, Ethan went down to the basement, opened Richard's box again, and looked at the photo of the newborn named Ethan Holloway. He placed beside it the photo of himself when he was found in Pennsylvania. The two faces lay side by side, separated by more than 2 years and nearly half a century of doubt. Ethan sat at the computer until after midnight. This time he did not close the web page. He entered his name, address, payment information, and secretly ordered a DNA test kit. In early November 2014, the DNA test kit Ethan Holloway ordered arrived at his house in Parma, Ohio. But nearly 2 weeks passed and he still had not opened it. Ethan knew his own DNA sample could not answer the question that had haunted him for more than 30 years. To know if he was truly Margaret's son, he needed a comparison sample from her. On the afternoon of November 23, Ethan brought the sample collection kit to the house on West 98th Street. Margaret was now over 70. Ethan explained that he wanted to check heart disease history and genetic conditions for his 2 children. "It's just a health test, right?" Margaret asked. Ethan was silent for a moment, then answered, "It can also confirm family relationships." Margaret looked at the kit on the table for a long time. Finally, she agreed. The next morning, Ethan sent the 2 samples to the lab. 3 days later, Margaret called. "Did you send them yet?" "Yes." She was silent for a few seconds. "Call them, Ethan. Tell them to cancel the test." "Why?" Margaret only said, "There are truths that, once known, "Don't make life better." Ethan understood what she was afraid of. He remembered the reports Richard had kept in the basement, the differences in age, eye color, and ear structure of the child found in Pennsylvania. But he had lived with doubt for too long. Ethan did not cancel the test. On the evening of December 18, 2014, the results were sent to his online account. Ethan opened the report at 7:43 p.m. He read the conclusion line once, then a second time. The probability of a mother-son relationship between Margaret Holloway and Ethan Holloway was 0.00%. He checked the names, sample codes, and lab information. There was no mistake. Margaret was not his biological mother. Ethan sat in front of the screen for nearly an hour. He did not cry, nor did he get angry. What he felt was a cold emptiness. If Margaret was not his biological mother, he was not the child abducted from the Cleveland hospital in 1968. The name Ethan Holloway did not belong to him. The birth date on his papers could be wrong. The place of birth could be wrong. The family medical history, ancestral origins, and the stories he had told his children about their lineage were all built on the life of another person. The next morning, Ethan went to see Margaret. When she saw the results folder in his hand, she immediately understood what had happened. "Did you know?" Ethan asked. Margaret shook her head. "I didn't know, but I was always afraid." She told him that Richard had had doubts from the first day they met Samuel in Pennsylvania. She herself had noticed the differences, but she could not leave a 2-year-old child with no family. "You stood alone in that room," Margaret said. "No one knew who you were. No one came for you." Ethan asked why she still called him Ethan when the police had never confirmed the identity. Margaret looked down at her hands. "Because I had already lost one child. I couldn't leave another child behind." Ethan did not blame her. Margaret had raised, protected, and loved him for more than 40 years. But that love could not answer the question that had become larger than everything else. "If I'm not Ethan," he asked, "then who am I?" Margaret could not answer. In early 2015, Ethan sent his DNA sample to 2 different genealogy databases. He began checking the results every evening after work. Most matches were distant relatives, but in February, 3 results with notable relationship levels appeared. All 3 were connected to a Bennett family that had lived in Buffalo, New York. Ethan searched birth records, obituaries, phone directories, and family trees of people with the Bennett surname. There was no Ethan Holloway. There was no Samuel Reed. But in that family's history, there were gaps in the early 1970s that he could not yet explain. The DNA results also forced the Cleveland Police Department to revisit the old case. Detective Frank Delaney had retired many years earlier. The document boxes on the Ethan Holloway abduction still sat in storage, but now one truth had been confirmed. The child brought home to the Holloways in 1970 was not Ethan. That meant the woman in the nurse's uniform had never been caught, the 1968 case had never been solved, and the real Ethan James Holloway was still missing. If still alive, he had spent nearly 47 years under a different name. In March 2015, Ethan sat in his office with his wife, Laura. On the table were the DNA results, the file Richard had left, and a list of Bennett family members in Buffalo. Laura asked if he wanted to continue the search. Ethan looked at the newborn photo of Ethan Holloway, then at the photo of himself when he was found in Pennsylvania. "I've spent almost my whole life trying to prove I was this child," he said. "Now I know I'm not," Laura asked. "So, do you want to find your real family?" Ethan nodded, but did not take his eyes off the 2 photos. "I need to know who I am." He paused for a few seconds and placed his hand on the abduction case file. "But if I'm not Ethan Holloway, then the real child still hasn't been found." Ethan looked at Laura. "I don't just need to find my own name. I have to know what really happened to Ethan." In April 2015, after many weeks of following DNA matches but unable to determine his true origin, Ethan Holloway contacted Dr. Claire Morgan, a genetic genealogy expert in Columbus, Ohio. On April 14, Ethan brought to Claire's office the test results with Margaret along with the file box Richard had left behind. After reviewing the reports, Claire said directly, "Both independent tests give the same result. You have no blood relation to the Holloway family." Ethan asked if there was any possibility of error. Claire shook her head. "You are not Ethan James Holloway. What we need to do now is find out who you really are." Claire began analyzing the people whose DNA matched Ethan's and noticed many relationship branches concentrated around Buffalo, New York. Meanwhile, Ethan sent the test results along with a request to reopen the case to the Cleveland Police Department. On May 4, 2015, the Ethan Holloway abduction file was transferred from storage to the cold case unit. Detective Naomi Brooks, 43 years old with 17 years of investigative experience, was assigned to the case. Naomi spent many weeks rereading the entire file from May 16, 1968. She reviewed Margaret and Richard's statements, janitor James Collins's statement, laundry worker Dorothy Mills's statement, receiving dock worker Robert Gaines's statement, the suspect sketch, the hospital diagram, the staff duty list, and the anonymous letter sent to the Holloway family. On the board in her office, Naomi wrote 3 questions. Who knew Ethan's name? Who knew Margaret's room number? Who knew the family was scheduled to be discharged the next morning? In her view, the woman in the nurse's uniform could not have obtained all 3 pieces of information by chance. When reviewing the list of previously investigated individuals, Naomi stopped at Elaine Porter. Elaine had worked as an assistant at a private clinic, had lost a child at birth, and had experience in a medical environment. Police in 1968 had temporarily ruled her out because records showed Elaine left Cleveland on April 29. Naomi reread the documents and noted next to her name. No proof she did not return. The Youngstown receipt only proved Elaine was there on April 30th, more than 2 weeks before the abduction. No one had determined where she was on the day Ethan disappeared. Naomi continued checking Dr. Harold Pierce's file. Harold had worked at the clinic where Elaine was an assistant, was present at the hospital on the afternoon of May 16, and had been questioned twice by Detective Frank Delaney. His alibi was based on the duty log and statements from Dr. Leonard Hayes and Nurse Carol Benton. But there was no report confirming who had recorded Harold's time on the second floor, or whether he had left for any short period. In February 1969, as the investigation began to cool, Harold moved to Knoxville, Tennessee. Naomi placed the names Elaine and Harold next to each other on the board. The two had worked at the same clinic. One had disappeared from local records. The other had left Ohio less than a year after the abduction. The original investigation had never verified whether they continued to have contact. While Naomi retraced the old suspects, Claire Morgan focused on Ethan's true identity. By July 2015, she had built a family tree with more than 300 people. The 3 closest DNA matches all led back to Vernon Bennett and Diane Bennett, a couple who had lived on the east side of Buffalo. Birth records showed that on March 2, 1968, Diane gave birth to fraternal twins named Lucas Bennett and Lily Bennett. But after 1970, both children disappeared from school, medical, and residency records. Claire located old files from Erie County Child Services and discovered the Bennett family had been reported multiple times by neighbors for child neglect. In a June 1970 report, Vernon said Lucas and Lily had been sent to live with relatives in Pennsylvania. The social worker accepted the explanation and closed the file. There was no name of relatives, receiving address, or guardianship transfer documents. Naomi requested verification of the Bennett family's surviving relatives. No one had ever received Lucas or Lily. Patricia Bennett, Vernon's sister, told police, "My brother just said the 2 children had been taken away. No one in the family knows where they are." The timing of Lucas's disappearance closely matched the day Samuel Reed was found at South Hills Village. Age, gender, malnourishment, and the bruise around the eye all matched the old descriptions of Lucas. Claire found young photos of Vernon, Diane, and an older Bennett son, and sent them to forensic imaging expert Michael Grant. In September 2015, Michael completed an age-progressed image of Lucas Bennett at age 47. Naomi placed the photo next to Ethan's current photo. The jawline, bridge of the nose, and distance between the eyes had many similarities. Ethan looked at the 2 photos for a long time. "Is Lucas Bennett my real name?" he asked. Claire replied, "There is a very high probability, but we need DNA." After many weeks of searching, police identified Patricia Bennett, who was now living in Rochester, New York. She agreed to provide a sample. On September 28, 2015, Naomi met Ethan at the cold case unit. "If the results confirm a blood relationship, we will know where you came from," she said. Ethan asked, "What about Lily Bennett?" Naomi was silent for a moment, then answered, If you are Lucas, then your twin sister has also been missing for more than 45 years. Ethan looked down at the copies of the two children's files. He had spent nearly his entire life searching for his own identity, but now the investigation might be opening another missing persons case. That afternoon, Detective Naomi Brooks signed the request to send Ethan's and Patricia Bennett's DNA samples to the lab for comparison, hoping that for the first time in 45 years, one of the two children who had disappeared from Buffalo would have their real name returned. On October 19, 2015, Detective Naomi Brooks received the DNA test results from the Ohio State Laboratory. The sample from the man who had lived nearly 45 years under the name Ethan Holloway showed a blood relationship consistent with Patricia Bennett, Vernon Bennett's sister. Combined with the family tree data built by Dr. Claire Morgan, the results confirmed that Samuel Reed, the unidentified child found in Pennsylvania in 1970, was actually Lucas Bennett, one of the two twins who had disappeared from Buffalo. That afternoon, Naomi called Ethan to the cold case unit. Claire placed a copy of the March 2, 1968 birth certificate in front of him. "We have identified your identity," Naomi said. "Your real name is Lucas Bennett." Ethan looked at the name on the paper for a long time. In 47 years, he had been Samuel Reed in child welfare records, and then Ethan Holloway in his family, school, and adult life. Now he had a third name, but for the first time it was one that truly belonged to him. Claire pointed to the line below. "You have a twin sister, Lily Bennett." Ethan looked up. "Where is she?" Naomi replied. "That is something we don't yet know." In November 2015, Naomi and Detective Daniel Russo of the Buffalo Police Department began reviewing all the old Bennett family files. Vernon Bennett had unstable work at auto repair shops and warehouses. Diane Bennett stayed home with the children, but was often seen drunk in the daytime by neighbors. Police records showed officers had responded 3 times to the house on Sycamore Street for arguments and domestic violence. In 1969, Diane was hospitalized after being beaten by Vernon, but she refused to cooperate, so no charges were filed. Surviving neighbors were located. Arthur Collins, 82 years old, remembered children's crying, often echoing for hours from the Bennett house. "There were nights we heard the two of them crying until after midnight," he said. Then Vernon would turn the music up really loud. Helen Morris, another neighbor, had called child services twice after seeing bruises on Lucas' face. Social workers came to check, but Vernon explained his son had fallen while playing, and Diane promised to take better care of the children. No long-term intervention was ever made. An important lead emerged when police found Marjorie Ellis, who had once babysat for the Bennett family. Naomi and Russo met her at her home in Tonawanda. When shown the photo of Samuel Reed when he was found at South Hills Village, Marjorie recognized the bruise around the left eye. "Lucas often had bruises like that," she said. Marjorie recounted that the last time she went to the Bennett house in the spring of 1970, she saw Lucas and Lily locked in a small room on the second floor. The window was covered with an old blanket, dirty clothes lay on the floor, and the room only had 2 small beds. "The two of them were very skinny," Marjorie said. Lucas had a bruise around his eye. Lily kept holding her brother's hand and wouldn't let go. She threatened to report to child services, but Vernon got angry and banned her from returning. A few weeks later, the 2 children disappeared. Vernon and Diane told neighbors that Lucas and Lily had been sent to live with relatives in Pennsylvania because the family could not afford to care for them. No one asked for an address. Naomi checked school, hospital, child services, and guardianship records in New York and Pennsylvania. There were no documents proving the 2 children had ever been transferred to relatives. Surviving Bennett family relatives all denied having received Lucas or Lily. In January 2016, Naomi met with Lucas again and let him hear the statements. He looked at photos of the house on Sycamore Street and tried to find something familiar in his memory. Fragmented images began returning. A dark room, 2 small beds, the sound of a man yelling in the hallway, and a little girl crying at night. "I used to think those were just dreams," Lucas said. Claire replied, "They may be your last memories of Buffalo." Lucas asked who had taken him to Pennsylvania. Naomi admitted police did not yet know. The time period from when Lucas disappeared from Buffalo until he was found at South Hills Village remained completely blank. No one knew how he had been taken, who had cared for him, or why Lily had not appeared with him. Lucas looked at his sister's file. If I'm still alive, Lily could still be alive. Naomi did not deny it, but she made clear there were no school, medical, or official records in the name Lily Bennett after 1970. The truth returned Lucas's identity, but at the same time forced him to face a painful paradox. He was a missing child who had been found and then used to fill the place of another missing child. While Richard and Margaret Holloway had spent years searching for Ethan, Lucas's biological parents had never reported him and Lily missing to the police. Naomi returned to the old Erie County Child Services reports and discovered a name that appeared multiple times: Ruth Caldwell, the woman who lived 2 houses away from the Bennetts. From December 1969 to June 1970, Ruth had reported at least 3 times that Vernon beat the children, that the 2 children were often left hungry, and that they were locked inside the house. The final call was recorded on June 21, 1970. 1 week later, neighbors no longer saw Lucas and Lily. When Naomi checked Ruth's file, she discovered the woman had also left Buffalo in the same week the 2 children disappeared. Ruth quit her job at a grocery store, returned her apartment, and left no forwarding address. She may have just happened to move, Russo said. Naomi placed the 2 timelines next to each other. But she was the person who kept trying to protect the 2 children. We need to know where she went. Investigators checked tax records, voter registrations, driver's licenses, and old phone directories. After many days of searching, they discovered that in August 1970, less than 2 months after Lucas and Lily disappeared, a woman named Ruth Caldwell had rented a small house on Jefferson Avenue in Huntington, West Virginia. Naomi asked local police to check all records related to Ruth, including people who had lived with her, children registered at that address, and school documents in the following years. Lucas looked at the address on the file. After 45 years, the investigation had found a woman who left Buffalo at the exact time the 2 children disappeared and appeared in another city just a few weeks later. If Ruth Caldwell had taken Lucas from the Bennett family and abandoned him in Pennsylvania, she might be the last person who knew what had happened to Lily. But if Ruth had taken both children and only left Lucas, then in Huntington there might still be traces proving Lily Bennett had survived after 1970. In February 2016, Detective Naomi Brooks and Dr. Claire Morgan began tracing Ruth Caldwell's life in Huntington, West Virginia, hoping to determine what had happened in the time between when Lucas and Lily Bennett disappeared from Buffalo and when Lucas was found in Pennsylvania. Residency records showed Ruth had never married and spent most of her life in a small house on Jefferson Avenue. However, from the fall of 1970, a little girl named Sarah Caldwell appeared at her address. School records listed Sarah as Ruth's daughter, but the birth certificate was only filed in December 1972, when the child was nearly 5 years old. Naomi noticed many irregularities. No hospital name where Sarah was born, no doctor's signature, the father's name left blank, and Ruth claiming the daughter was born at home in Kentucky, with no witnesses to confirm it. Claire checked medical records and found Sarah had no documents at all before 1970. This child appeared exactly when Lily Bennett disappeared, Claire said. Ruth had passed away in 2008 at age 78, so police could not question her directly. Naomi contacted Ruth's estate manager and learned that some personal belongings were still stored in the warehouse of the First Presbyterian Church, where Ruth had participated in charity work. On February 19, Naomi and Detective Daniel Russo went to Huntington. In a cardboard box labeled Ruth Caldwell, they found dozens of family photos, letters, a storage mailbox key, and 3 old diaries. The first diary began in 1969. Naomi read the pages related to the Bennett family and realized Ruth was the person who had repeatedly reported Lucas and Lily's condition to child services. On March 14, 1970, Ruth wrote that she heard the 2 children crying for nearly 5 hours. 2 days later, she saw Lucas with a bruise around his eye while Lily was so skinny that her 2 little wrists were like twigs. Ruth called child services, but once again no long-term protection was implemented. In the diary entry for June 22, Ruth wrote, "If they send the 2 children back to that house one more time, I'm afraid one of them will die." Naomi continued reading. According to the diary, Ruth had decided to take Lucas and Lily away from the Bennett family herself. She knew the action was illegal, but she believed the child welfare system would continue returning the two children to Vernon and Diane. On the morning of June 27, 1970, Ruth prepared clothes, cash, and her old car to take both children to West Virginia. But when she returned to the house on Sycamore Street, Lucas had already disappeared. Ruth wrote that Vernon said his son had been taken to live with an acquaintance in Pennsylvania. She did not believe him, but did not know where Lucas was. Lily was still locked in the upstairs room. Ruth waited until evening, when Vernon and Diane left the house, then took the little girl away. "I left Lucas behind," she wrote. "I don't know where the boy is, and I will have to live with that." Ruth drove out of Buffalo that night, avoiding major routes, and arrived in Huntington a few days later. She changed Lily's name to Sarah Caldwell, told neighbors the child was the daughter of a deceased relative, and began building a new identity for the girl. 2 years later, Ruth filed a delayed birth certificate so Sarah could attend school. The diary showed Ruth understood she had broken the law. "If the police find us, they will take her back," she wrote. "I cannot let that happen." In the years that followed, Ruth lived in fear of being discovered. She switched schools for Sarah twice, limited photographs, and never spoke about Buffalo. But the diary pages also showed she raised Lily as her own daughter, took the girl to school, cared for her when sick, and worked extra jobs to support their life. Naomi read to the final page related to Lucas. Ruth wrote that before leaving Buffalo, she heard Diane say Vernon had taken the boy down to Pennsylvania because he did not want child services to keep asking questions. There was no specific location, but the detail matched Lucas being found at South Hills Village a few weeks later. Naomi immediately forwarded the information to Buffalo police to open an investigative direction into Vernon and Diane Bennett's role in abandoning Lucas. Claire focused on verifying Sarah Caldwell. Records showed Sarah graduated from Huntington High School in 1986, studied library science at Marshall University, and then worked at the Cabell County Public Library. She had been married once but divorced, had an adult daughter, and still lived in Huntington. There were no records indicating Sarah had ever known she was Lily Bennett. On February 23, Naomi contacted the library director and confirmed Sarah still worked at the West Huntington branch. She requested that no one approach Sarah until police prepared an appropriate notification plan. That afternoon, Naomi returned to Cleveland and met with Lucas. On the table were copies of the irregular birth certificate, Ruth's diary pages, and a current photo of Sarah Caldwell, taken from the library staff information page. Naomi said, "We have very strong reason to believe Sarah Caldwell may be Lily Bennett." Lucas did not reply. He picked up the photo. The woman in the photo was nearly 50 years old, with short hair streaked with gray, standing among bookshelves. Lucas looked at the facial features, bridge of the nose, and chin shape. But what he could not look away from were the eyes. He had seen those eyes every morning in the mirror for nearly 50 years. Claire sat across from him and asked, "Do you recognize anything?" Lucas put the photo down and picked it up again. His hand trembled slightly. "The eyes," he said. "She has the exact same eyes as me." In the quiet room of the cold case unit, Lucas looked at the photo of the woman who might be the twin sister he had lost when he was 2 years old, and for the first time in 45 years, Lily Bennett no longer seemed like just a name in a missing persons file. In March 2016, Lucas Bennett went to Huntington, West Virginia, with Detective Naomi Brooks to meet Sarah Caldwell, the woman police believed might be his twin sister. The meeting took place after closing hours at the Cabell County Public Library. Sarah sat across from Lucas with a wary expression. Naomi had explained the Bennett family file, Ruth Caldwell's diary, and the irregularities in the birth certificate, but Sarah still did not believe it. "Ruth is my mother," she said. "I am not Lily Bennett." Naomi replied that DNA would provide the answer, but before taking a sample, she wanted to ask Sarah about her earliest memories. Sarah was silent and then said that sometimes she dreamed of a dark room, a covered window, 2 small beds, and a boy with a bruise around his eye. She also remembered the sound of adults arguing downstairs and the feeling of having to lie still to avoid being noticed. Lucas looked at Sarah. Those images were almost identical to the memories that had followed him for many years. "I remember that room too," he said. Sarah did not reply. Naomi asked if she remembered anything about the boy. Sarah said the two of them often sang when they were scared, but she did not remember the whole song. Lucas suddenly recalled a short melody that had appeared in his dreams. He sang softly, "Close your eyes, count to 3, morning comes for you and me." Sarah immediately looked up. "Almost by reflex," she continued. "Hold my hand, don't make a sound. When the sun comes, we'll be found." The room fell silent. Sarah covered her mouth with her hand. "I don't know why I know that." Lucas looked at her. "Maybe because we used to sing it together." Sarah agreed to provide a DNA sample. On April 4, 2016, the test results confirmed that Lucas Bennett and Sarah Caldwell had a blood relationship consistent with fraternal twins. Sarah was Lily Bennett, the child who had disappeared from Buffalo in 1970. Naomi personally brought the results to Huntington. Sarah read the report many times and then asked, "So Ruth was not my biological mother?" Naomi confirmed that, but reminded her that according to the diary, Ruth had taken her away from the house where Lucas and Lily were being abused. Sarah burst into tears. The woman she had called mother for nearly half a century had saved her from Vernon and Diane Bennett, but had also hidden her true identity until she died. Lucas sat beside her, understanding the feeling that a DNA result could shatter the entire story a person believed about themselves. "What should I call myself?" Sarah asked. Lucas replied, "You don't have to erase the life you've lived." After many weeks of thought, she decided to use the name Lily Sarah Bennett on some personal documents and with her newly identified biological family, but she kept the name Sarah at work. "Sarah is the person Ruth raised," she said. "Lily is the child who disappeared. Both are me." Finding each other did not immediately make Lucas and Lily close. They had been separated for more than 45 years, had grown up in 2 different states, and had their own families. The first phone calls often ended in long silences. Lucas wanted to know about Ruth, while Lily sometimes felt he was judging the woman who had saved her. Lily wanted to understand how Margaret Holloway had treated him, but Lucas did not know how to explain being loved under the identity of another child. They met several times in the following months, looked at old photos, and compared fragmented memories. Sometimes they both laughed when they realized they hated the same food, or had the habit of tapping their fingers on the table when thinking. But they also understood that blood relation could not return the lost childhood. In June 2016, Lucas and Lily visited Spring Hill Cemetery to see Ruth Caldwell's grave. Lily placed flowers in front of the headstone and said, "She saved me." Lucas nodded, "But she also let me live my whole life without knowing who I was." Lily looked at him. "If Ruth had called the police, they might have sent me back to Vernon and Diane." Lucas could not deny it. The Child Services files showed Ruth's fear had been justified. She had broken the law by taking Lily from Buffalo, but that action may have saved the girl's life. The two left the cemetery unable to see Ruth as only a child rescuer or only the creator of a secret that lasted for decades. 1 week later, Naomi returned to Huntington to examine Ruth's remaining belongings. In an old mailbox box containing bills, family photos, and faded papers, she found many newspaper clippings cut from the late 1960s. One article from 1968 was about the Ethan Holloway abduction from the Cleveland hospital. Naomi immediately noticed it because Ruth had been living in Buffalo at the time and had no clear connection to the Holloway family. She turned the clipping over and saw a faded handwritten line, "Doctor knows the woman." Naomi reread the article. In the section about people questioned by police was the name Doctor. Harold Pierce, the doctor who had been at the hospital on the afternoon Ethan disappeared and later moved to Tennessee. Ruth had circled his name with a pen. Naomi placed the clipping into an evidence bag and called Detective Daniel Russo. "Ruth Caldwell knew Harold Pierce's name," she said, "and she may have suspected him since 1968. Russo asked if Ruth had ever met Harold. Naomi looked at the handwritten line on the back of the clipping. "We don't know yet." But she didn't keep this article for nearly 50 years without a reason. After ending the call, Naomi looked again at the circled name. The investigation had found Lucas, found Lily, and returned identities to the 2 missing children. But the real Ethan Holloway still had not been found. And after nearly half a century, the case had come back to Dr. Harold Pierce, the doctor who had been questioned twice and then left Ohio with no one following up. After finding the newspaper clipping in Ruth Caldwell's belongings, Detective Naomi Brooks returned to the entire file on Dr. Harold Pierce and Elaine Porter. She requested the Cleveland Police Department, the FBI, and Tennessee State Archives to provide employment, medical, tax, and address records for the two individuals from 1966 to 1975. The new documents showed that Elaine had been pregnant in 1966, but lost the child in the 8th month. After serious complications, doctors determined she would have great difficulty getting pregnant again. The doctor who treated Elaine at the private clinic on Euclid Avenue was Harold Pierce, who was then a young physician working part-time before transferring to the hospital where Ethan Holloway was born. Naomi checked the personnel files and realized Harold had not only known Elaine through a few casual meetings, as he had claimed in 1968. He had directly treated her for many months. Address change documents also showed Elaine left Cleveland at the end of April 1968, while Harold moved to Knoxville, Tennessee, in February 1969. The two appeared in the same city less than a year apart. Naomi asked Knoxville police to check old residency records. In November 1968, Elaine Porter rented a house on Magnolia Avenue. In the landlord's file, she stated she was living with her newborn son named Matthew Porter. Matthew's birth certificate was filed late in March 1969. The document recorded the boy was born at home on May 16, 1968, with no father's name, no hospital, and no delivering doctor. The only person who signed to confirm the information was Dr. Harold Pierce. Naomi looked at the birth date on the certificate and called Claire Morgan. "The exact day Ethan disappeared," she said. Claire replied, "If Matthew is Ethan, they didn't just change his name. They created a whole new life for the boy." Obstetric records in Cleveland, Youngstown, and Knoxville showed no record of Elaine being pregnant or giving birth in 1968. People who had lived near Elaine's house in Knoxville were located. A woman named Martha Jenkins remembered Elaine appearing with an infant a few months old, but never clearly explaining where the baby was born. She said, "Matthew was her son," Martha recalled, "but I never saw her pregnant." Harold began working at a clinic less than 3 miles from Elaine's house. Naomi continued, searching for evidence of a relationship between the two, and discovered in the archives of a lawyer who had handled Harold's estate a box of unclaimed letters. Harold had passed away in 2009, but many letters from the late 1960s were still kept. Among them were 4 letters Elaine had sent him before the abduction. One dated May 9, 1968 read, "I need to know when the maternity ward is least crowded." Another asked about the back door near the laundry area. Most important was the letter Harold sent Elaine on May 13. He listed the duty schedules of some nurses, the times Richard Holloway usually left the hospital, and the route from the 3rd floor down to the loading dock using the service elevator. Naomi read the letter multiple times. This information explained how the woman who abducted Ethan knew the patient's exact name, room number, and the least noticed route. Harold didn't just know Elaine, Naomi told Detective Daniel Russo. He helped her prepare. Police obtained a warrant to seize all remaining documents related to the two individuals. A photo taken in Knoxville in 1971 showed Elaine standing in front of the house on Magnolia Avenue with a boy about 3 years old. On the back of the photo was written, "Matthew, summer 1971. Claire Morgan used this photo along with Holloway family data to search genealogy databases. She discovered that one of Matthew Porter's children had submitted a DNA sample to explore ancestral origins. The results showed this person had multiple close genetic relationships with members of the Holloway family in Ohio. Claire immediately reported to Naomi. "We cannot yet confirm Matthew is Ethan," she said, "but the probability that an unrelated person would have so many close DNA connections to the Holloway family is extremely low." Matthew Porter was then 67 years old, retired after many years as a construction engineer, and living in a suburb of Nashville. Naomi contacted him on August 18, 2016. In their first meeting, she presented the irregularities in the birth certificate, Elaine's medical records, and Harold's connection to the abduction. Matthew reacted with anger. "My mother did not kidnap anyone," he said. "She raised me my whole life. You're trying to turn a dead woman into a criminal because she can't defend herself." Naomi suggested he provide a DNA sample. Matthew refused. "I know who I am," Naomi said. "You have the right to refuse. But your children have blood ties to the Holloway family." Matthew stood up. "Do not contact my family again." Without a court order, Police could not force him to test. Naomi informed Lucas of the situation. Lucas looked at the photo of young Matthew and understood the irony of the case. He had lived nearly 45 years under the name Ethan Holloway, while the man who might actually be the real Ethan had lived his entire life under the name Matthew Porter. The two had never met, but their lives were connected by the same abduction. Lucas asked for Matthew's address, but Naomi refused because the investigation was still ongoing. He decided to write a letter and asked her to forward it. Lucas wrote that he did not want to force Matthew to abandon the mother who had raised him, nor did he want to destroy the man's life. He described being found unidentified in Pennsylvania, being brought to Cleveland, and living under the name Ethan Holloway until DNA proved he was Lucas Bennett. At the end of the letter, Lucas wrote, "I have lived almost my entire life under the name of a child I was not. I believe that child is you. I do not ask you to believe the police, nor do I ask you to abandon the mother who raised you. I only hope you will take the test. Because if you are Ethan Holloway, there is a mother who has been waiting for you for nearly 50 years, and both of us deserve to know the truth." Matthew Porter read Lucas Bennett's letter many times, over nearly 3 weeks before calling Detective Naomi Brooks back. On September 12, 2016, he agreed to meet Lucas in a conference room at the Nashville Police Department. Matthew arrived first, sat alone at the table, and placed the folded letter in his jacket pocket. When Lucas walked in, the two men looked at each other in silence. Lucas spoke first. "I did not come here to take your name, your family, or your life. I only want to know the truth about both of us." Matthew asked Lucas how it felt to learn he was not Ethan Holloway. Lucas replied, "I lost my name in a single day, but at least I had the chance to find it again. Maybe you are standing before that chance too." Matthew said Elaine Porter had raised him from a young age, taken him to school, cared for him when he was sick, and worked for many years so he could attend college. "You want me to believe that woman kidnapped me?" he asked. Lucas shook his head. "I am not asking you to believe anyone. Just let DNA answer." After nearly 2 hours of conversation, Matthew agreed to provide a sample on the condition that the results would not be released to the press before he was ready. Naomi accepted. On September 14, Matthew's sample was sent to the lab for comparison with Margaret Holloway's sample and other Holloway family relatives. 3 weeks later, Naomi received the results. The probability that Matthew Porter was the biological son of Margaret Holloway exceeded 99.99%. The man who had lived 68 years under the name Matthew Porter was Ethan James Holloway, the child abducted from the Cleveland Hospital on May 16, 1968. Naomi informed Matthew of the results in a small meeting room in Nashville. Lucas and Claire Morgan were also present at his request. Matthew read the report twice and then set it down on the table. "So Elaine kidnapped me?" he asked. Naomi replied that DNA only confirmed identity, but Harold Pierce's letters, the false birth certificate, and obstetric records showed Elaine was directly involved in the abduction. Matthew lowered his head. The woman he had called mother for nearly 70 years had both raised him and may have stolen him from his biological family. But Matthew's memories of Elaine were not entirely painful. He remembered her working 2 jobs when he was young, sitting by his bed all night when he had a fever, and saving money so he could go to college. Elaine was strict, spoke little about the past, but had never abandoned him. "I cannot turn all those years into lies just because she did one terrible thing," Matthew said. Lucas replied, "You don't have to. The person who raised us can love us and still hide unforgivable truths." That same day, Naomi flew back to Cleveland to meet Margaret Holloway. She was now over 80 years old and living in a care facility near Parma. Naomi placed the DNA results in front of her. "We have found Ethan," she said. Margaret looked at Naomi for a long time and then asked, "Is my son still alive?" Naomi nodded. "He is alive." Margaret burst into tears. She demanded to see her son immediately. "I have waited nearly 50 years, she said. "I don't have much time left." Naomi explained that Matthew had just learned his entire life was built on an abduction and needed time to accept the truth. Margaret asked, "Does he know I never stopped waiting?" Naomi replied that Matthew had been shown the newspaper articles and files about the family's search. Margaret only said, "Tell him I don't need him to call me mother. I just want to see my son once." Matthew received the message 2 days later. He did not refuse to meet Margaret, but he could not agree immediately either. "I understand she is my biological mother," he told Lucas, "but I have no memories of her." Lucas understood. He had also just found Lily, but new blood relation could not immediately create closeness. While the family prepared for a possible meeting, Naomi continued investigating Elaine Porter. Previous records listed Elaine as deceased, but a recheck of Social Security data showed that was a different woman with the same name. The real Elaine Porter was still alive, 90 years old, in Asheville, North Carolina. She lived alone in a small house on the city outskirts and used the name Elaine Foster Porter. Naomi immediately notified the FBI and the Asheville Police Department. Investigators surveilled the house and confirmed Elaine was still mentally sharp, drove herself to the store, and received mail at that address. Property records showed she had lived in Asheville since 1994. Naomi requested checks of storage units and properties in Elaine's name. A private storage facility confirmed she had rented a small unit since 1998. With the prosecutor's approval, police obtained a warrant to seize documents related to the abduction. In old bank records, Naomi also discovered Elaine had repeatedly ordered copies of newspaper articles about the Holloway family. A former caregiver who had helped clean her house remembered there was a box in the bedroom containing articles about the abduction of a newborn in Cleveland. "She never let me touch that box," the woman said. This information strengthened the suspicion that Elaine had followed the Holloway family's life for decades. Naomi presented all the evidence to the prosecutor. The letters exchanged with Harold Pierce, information about duty schedules and the service elevator route. The delayed birth certificate for Matthew signed by Harold. Medical records confirming Elaine did not give birth in 1968, DNA results proving Matthew was Ethan Holloway, and Elaine's retention of documents about the victim's family. The federal prosecutor and the Cuyahoga County Prosecutor's Office decided there was sufficient basis to search her residence and storage unit. On the morning of October 17, 2016, Detective Naomi Brooks and FBI agents were in Asheville. While Elaine Porter still did not know the child she had taken from the hospital nearly half a century earlier had been identified by DNA, police presented a federal judge with a warrant to search her house and the storage unit containing the secrets she had kept for 48 years. On the morning of October 18, 2016, Detective Naomi Brooks, along with 6 FBI agents and Asheville police, executed the search warrant at Elaine Porter's house in the suburbs of Asheville, North Carolina. Elaine, then 90 years old, was sitting in the living room when the investigators arrived. She did not resist, only asked Naomi, "You've come because of Matthew, haven't you?" Naomi did not answer. For nearly 8 hours, police searched every room, closet, cardboard box, and drawer. In a wooden trunk in the bedroom, they found an old white nurse's uniform, carefully folded beneath several layers of clothing. Elaine had never worked as a nurse at the Cleveland hospital. Naomi immediately ordered the uniform sealed. At the storage unit Elaine rented south of the city, agents found a dark green cloth bag matching Dorothy Mills's description. The laundry worker who had seen the suspect leaving the maternity ward on the afternoon, Ethan, disappeared. Inside a metal box were many photos of Matthew as a newborn. One photo caught Naomi's attention, the child lying on a white blanket, still wearing the hospital identification band on his wrist. When enlarged, technicians could read part of the word Holloway on the plastic band. In another file folder, police found a copy of Margaret Holloway's birth record, noting the room number, Ethan's date of birth, and the scheduled discharge time. Next to it was the delayed birth certificate for Matthew Porter, a document bearing Dr. Harold Pierce's confirming signature. More evidence continued to appear in a locked mailbox. There were 12 letters Harold had sent Elaine from 1967 to 1969. One letter described how to use the service elevator to go from the 3rd floor to the loading dock area. Another noted the times when the maternity ward had the fewest staff and the names of nurses who usually left their posts during shift changes. In the letter dated May 13, 1968, 3 days before the abduction, Harold wrote, "If you still decide to do this, after 4 o'clock we'll have the least attention. Do not use the main entrance." Naomi read that sentence and turned to FBI Special Agent Michael Harris. Harold helped her prepare. At the house, police also seized 6 of Elaine's diaries. Pages written from May 1968 showed she had followed Margaret for many days. Lane recorded the times Richard arrived at the hospital when he usually left the room, and the times Ethan was taken to the nursery. On May 16, she wrote, "I took the boy out. No one stopped me." Later pages showed Elaine had considered returning Ethan multiple times. When the newspapers published Margaret's plea, she wrote, "I thought about leaving the boy at a church, but a few days later, Elaine changed her mind. If I return him, I will lose everything. I will be his mother." Naomi asked Elaine to come to the Asheville Police Department for questioning. Initially, she denied abducting Ethan. When Naomi placed the photo of the child wearing the hospital band in front of her, Elaine fell silent. "Did you enter the hospital on May 16, 1968? Naomi asked. After nearly a minute, Elaine answered, "Yes. Did you take Ethan Holloway out of there?" Elaine looked down at the table. "Harold said it wouldn't hurt anyone." Naomi asked what Harold had done. Elaine said Harold himself had provided Margaret's name, the room number, staff duty schedules, and the route through the service elevator. After Elaine brought Ethan to Tennessee, Harold helped her register the new birth certificate and confirm the child as Matthew Porter. "He said the Holloway family would have other children," Elaine said. "But I could not." Naomi replied, "You took a child from his mother." Elaine was silent and then said, "I raised him. I loved him." Naomi did not argue. The evidence collected showed Harold Pierce had provided information, guided Elaine in approaching Ethan, and helped create a new identity for the child. But Harold had died in 2009 and could not be prosecuted. The federal prosecutor and the Cuyahoga County Prosecutor's Office decided to charge Elaine with crimes related to child abduction, falsifying documents, and conspiracy to conceal a victim's identity. On the afternoon of October 20, the arrest warrant was executed. Matthew Porter requested to be present. He stood across the street as two officers entered the house. A few minutes later, Elaine appeared between them, her hands cuffed in front because of her advanced age. When she saw Matthew, she stopped. "Matthew," she called. He did not respond. Elaine took another step but was held back by an officer. "Matthew, I did everything for you." He remained standing still. The woman in front of him was the person who had raised him, cared for him when sick, and devoted nearly her entire life to protecting the identity she had created. But she was also the person who had taken him from Margaret Holloway when he was less than 2 days old. Naomi stood nearby and did not ask Matthew to say anything. Elaine called his name one more time. "Matthew." He looked at her for a long time and then turned away. He did not yet know whether he should be Matthew Porter, the man who had lived nearly 70 years with Elaine, or Ethan Holloway, the child stolen from his family in 1968. Perhaps he would have to live with both names. Elaine was placed in the police car. The door closed, and the vehicle slowly drove away from the street. After more than 48 years, Elaine Porter was led from the house where she had kept the truth about Ethan Holloway hidden for nearly half a century. Elaine Porter's trial began on March 6, 2017, at the Cuyahoga County Courthouse in Cleveland, Ohio, nearly 49 years after the day Ethan Holloway was taken from the hospital. Although Elaine was 90 years old, Judge Robert Keller determined she was competent to stand trial. Prosecutor Daniel Price opened by asserting that the abduction was not an impulsive act by a woman grieving the loss of her child. The defendant knew the child's name, the mother's room number, the staff duty schedule, and the least used escape route. This was a plan prepared in advance. Price introduced the physical evidence recovered in Asheville one by one. The old white nurse's uniform, the green cloth bag matching 1968 witness descriptions, the photo of Ethan still wearing the hospital identification band, the copy of Margaret's birth record, the false birth certificate in the name Matthew Porter, and the letters exchanged between Elaine and Dr. Harold Pierce. The DNA results confirming Matthew was Ethan James Holloway were presented as the scientific evidence connecting the entire case. Dorothy Mills, the former hospital laundry worker, now over 80 years old, was called to testify. She acknowledged she could not make an absolute identification of Elaine after nearly half a century, but stated that on the afternoon Ethan disappeared, she saw a woman with a similar build and face to Elaine pushing a bassinet toward the service elevator while carrying a green cloth bag. When the prosecutor brought out the bag recovered from the storage unit, Dorothy said, "It looks like the kind of bag I saw that day." The next witness was Detective Naomi Brooks. She presented the process of reopening the file in 2015 after DNA testing proved the man living under the name Ethan Holloway had no blood relation to Margaret. Naomi explained how the original investigation had overlooked the connection between Elaine and Harold. Elaine had been Harold's patient, but he had claimed they only knew each other casually. Interstate records showed both appeared in Knoxville around the same time, and the false birth certificate for Matthew bore Harold's confirming signature. Individual details were once considered unimportant, Naomi said. When placed together, they show a plan that extended from before the abduction to many months afterward. Defense attorney Rebecca Hale asked why Elaine had not been arrested in 1968 if the evidence was as clear as the prosecution described. Naomi answered, "Because no one fully examined her relationship with Harold Pierce." Dr. Claire Morgan continued by presenting the role of genetic genealogy. She explained how DNA proved the person raised as Ethan was actually Lucas Bennett, leading police to the file on the missing twins in Buffalo, then identifying Sarah Caldwell as Lily Bennett. Afterward, DNA data from Matthew Porter's child created a link to the Holloway family and ultimately helped identify the real Ethan. 3 people lived for decades under identities that did not reflect their origins, Claire said. DNA does not return the lost years, but it allows us to determine who they truly are. Lucas Bennett was called to the witness stand on the 4th day of the trial. He described being found unidentified in Pennsylvania, being brought to Cleveland, and living for more than 40 years under the name Ethan Holloway. "I grew up in a family that loved me," Lucas said, "but I always felt I was living in someone else's story." He recounted the moment the DNA test proved Margaret was not his biological mother and having to find his real name at age 47. When Price asked what the greatest consequence was, Lucas replied, "I didn't just lose my identity. Throughout the time I lived as Ethan, the real Ethan was considered found. The search for a missing child stopped because of that mistake." Lily Sarah Bennett testified the next day. She described memories of the dark room in Buffalo, being taken by Ruth Caldwell, and living for nearly half a century without knowing she had a twin brother. "I know Ruth saved me from an abusive family," Lily said, "but being separated from my true identity caused me to lose my brother, my family history, and the right to know where I came from." Rebecca Hale objected to Lily's testimony being used to assign responsibility to Elaine, since Elaine was not involved in the separation of the Bennett children. Judge Keller agreed to limit the scope of the testimony, but allowed the prosecution to use Lucas's story to explain why the investigation into Ethan's abduction was not continued for many decades. Matthew Porter, confirmed as Ethan Holloway, stepped onto the witness stand amid silence in the courtroom. He said Elaine had raised him, cared for him, and given him a childhood he could not call unhappy. "I loved that woman," Matthew said. Then he looked toward Elaine. "But love does not change the fact that she took me from my biological parents, changed my name, and made me live 68 years without knowing who I was." Rebecca Hale built the defense around Elaine's psychological trauma after losing her child and being unable to have another pregnancy. She argued that Harold Pierce had exploited that despair, provided information, and pushed Elaine to commit the crime. "The defendant made a serious mistake," Hale said, "but she did not act for money, hatred, or a desire to harm the child. She acted from a mind broken by loss." Daniel Price responded that trauma could not explain nearly 50 years of concealing identity, falsifying documents, and remotely following the Holloway family. On the afternoon of the trial's 5th day, Price announced the prosecution's next witness. The courtroom door opened. Margaret Holloway, now needing a wheelchair, was brought in by court staff. Elaine looked up for the first time in many minutes. After nearly 49 years, the mother who had lost her child and the woman who had taken that child were finally in the same room. The court clerk called Margaret Holloway's name and invited her to the witness stand. Margaret Holloway was brought to the witness stand in a wheelchair, and, when she took the oath, she did not look toward Elaine Porter. Prosecutor Daniel Price placed in front of her a photo of Ethan taken at the hospital on May 15, 1968, and asked what she remembered about the afternoon that followed. Margaret was silent for a few seconds. "I remember that woman calling me by my correct name and my son's name," she said. "She was wearing a nurse's uniform. She said the doctor needed to check Ethan before discharge." Margaret recounted the moment. Elaine checked the identification band on the child's wrist, lifted Ethan, and pushed the bassinet out of the room. She turned back and said she would bring my son back in a few minutes. Price asked what had haunted her most for the past 49 years. Margaret looked down at her hands. "I handed my son over to her. No one snatched Ethan from my arms. I was the one who let her take the boy away." Her voice trembled. "I knew I had been tricked, but that did not stop me from waking up every night and thinking that if I had held on to him for a few more seconds, maybe everything would have been different." The courtroom was silent. Margaret spoke about the years of searching, the children's room kept unchanged, the fading posters, and the hope that came back to life when Samuel Reed was brought to Cleveland. "I loved Lucas as my son," she said. "But while I believed Ethan had returned, my biological son was still living somewhere else without knowing we were looking for him." When defense attorney Rebecca Hale began cross-examination, she emphasized that Matthew Porter had been well cared for by Elaine, had gone to school, had a family, and had a stable career. "Do you agree that Mr. Porter did not grow up in a childhood of starvation or abuse?" Margaret replied, "I am not saying she did not take care of him." Hale asked, "So you acknowledge that Mr. Porter had a stable childhood?" Margaret looked straight at the lawyer. "A stable childhood does not return the childhood that was taken from his real family." She paused and continued, "She may have loved my son, but she decided that her love was more important than another mother's right to keep her child." Rebecca Hale asked no further questions. After the prosecution finished presenting its evidence, Elaine requested to make a statement. She stepped up to the witness stand with the assistance of court staff. Elaine admitted that Harold Pierce had helped her prepare the abduction. He provided Margaret's name, the room number, staff duty schedules, and showed her the route through the service elevator. "Harold said if I really wanted a child, I had to decide before it was too late," Elaine said. Daniel Price asked if Harold had forced her. "No. Did you voluntarily wear the nurse's uniform and enter the hospital?" "Yes." "Did you know Ethan was the son of Richard and Margaret Holloway?" Elaine was silent and then answered, "Yes." Price asked why she still took the child. Elaine looked toward Matthew. "I had lost my child. I could not have another. I thought the Holloway family was still young. They could have more." An angry reaction arose from the seats behind. Judge Robert Keller called for order. Margaret closed her eyes, and Matthew lowered his head. Price asked, "You decided that because they could have more children, you had the right to take this child?" Elaine answered, "At the time I did not think of it that way." Price said, "But you had nearly 50 years to think again. You never returned him." Elaine did not answer. 2 days later, the jury began deliberations. After more than 7 hours of discussion, they returned to the courtroom. Elaine stood beside her lawyer. As the jury foreperson announced, she was guilty on the abduction and conspiracy charges still in effect under the applicable law, along with the charges related to falsifying documents and concealing a victim's identity. The sentencing hearing took place 3 weeks later. Rebecca Hale requested leniency due to Elaine's advanced age, declining health, and the fact that she had cared for Matthew for many decades. Daniel Price asked the court to consider the long-lasting consequences of the crime. A family that lost a child, an investigation that was stalled, and a man who lived nearly 70 years under a false identity. Before sentencing, Judge Keller looked at Elaine and said, "The court does not deny that you cared for the child you abducted. But love does not give anyone the right to steal a human being, erase their identity, and take them from their family." He imposed a long-term sentence that, at age 90, meant Elaine would almost certainly spend the rest of her life in prison. When the trial ended, Matthew stepped out into the hallway. Margaret was sitting in her wheelchair near the window, waiting with Lucas and Lily. Matthew stopped a few steps away from her. Margaret looked at the gray-haired man she had only known when he was a 2-day-old baby. She did not call his name. Matthew also did not step forward immediately. After a few seconds, Margaret reached out her hand. Matthew looked at that hand, then moved closer and took it. He knew the woman in front of him was his biological mother, But between them there were no birthdays, family meals, or childhood memories to fill nearly half a century of separation. Margaret said softly, "I don't need you to call me anything." Matthew stood quietly beside her. For the first time since learning the truth, he no longer had to choose immediately whether he was Matthew Porter or Ethan Holloway. But when he looked at the mother who had waited nearly 50 years for him, he still did not know what to call her. After the trial ended, Margaret Holloway and Matthew Porter met privately in a small visiting room at the care facility where she was living near Parma. There were no police, reporters, or cameras. Matthew came alone and stood outside the door for nearly a minute before entering. Margaret looked at the 68-year-old man in front of her for a long time. She recognized Richard's eyes, the jawline, and the way he slightly tilted his head whenever he did not know what to say. "You look like your father," Margaret said. Matthew sat down in the chair across from her. "I have seen his photos," Margaret nodded. Richard had died 13 years earlier and never knew his biological son was still alive. Matthew was silent and then said, "I don't know what to call you, Mrs. Holloway." Margaret did not look disappointed. "You don't need to call me by any name that makes you uncomfortable." She took a small box from the drawer. Inside was the hospital identification band preserved from May 1968, the remaining band from Ethan's birth records. Margaret placed it next to Matthew's wrist. The small piece of plastic was too tiny to fit around the grown man's wrist. "The other one was on your arm when they took you away," she said. Matthew looked at the faded Holloway name. Margaret continued, "I don't need you to remember me. You were only 2 days old. I just want you to know that you were never forgotten." Matthew lowered his head. After a long moment, he reached out and took her hand. It was not yet the closeness of a son returning to his mother, but it was the first time the two sat together without case files or DNA results between them. While Matthew tried to build a relationship with Margaret, Lucas Bennett faced another fear. For more than 40 years, he had lived in the Holloway family as Ethan. Margaret had raised him, Richard had taught him to drive, attended his graduation, and stood beside him on his wedding day. But now the real Ethan had returned. Lucas began visiting Margaret less often. When she asked, he said he was busy with work. Finally, Margaret asked him to come see her. "You think I don't need you anymore, don't you?" she asked. Lucas did not answer. Margaret said, "DNA gave you back your name. It does not erase more than 40 years that I was your mother." Lucas looked at her. "But Ethan is your biological son," Margaret replied. "Yes, and you are still my son." She held his hand. "I lost one child in 1968. I will not let the truth make me lose another one." Lucas cried for the first time since the investigation began. A few weeks later, Matthew and Lucas met at Margaret's house. The initial conversation was filled with silences. One had lived almost his entire life under the other's name. Lucas said, "I did not choose to become Ethan Holloway." Matthew replied, "I know. Just as I did not choose to become Matthew Porter." Neither was at fault with the other, but each one's existence reminded the other of the life that had been changed. Matthew asked what kind of father Richard had been. Lucas told him about baseball games, mornings at the machine shop, and the silence when Richard doubted his son's identity. Lucas asked how Elaine had raised Matthew. Matthew spoke about dinners, the times she sat by his bed when he was sick, and the questions about the past that she always avoided. They understood that no one could give the other the life that should have belonged to them. But from those meetings, the hesitation gradually gave way to a relationship without a clear name. Lucas also continued building a relationship with Lily Sarah Bennett. The two called each other every week, met on birthdays, and began learning about the Bennett family history. Lily came to Cleveland to meet Margaret and Matthew. She told Lucas that finding him did not make the years of separation disappear, but at least from now on they no longer had to live without knowing the other existed. In the fall of 2017, Margaret suggested they all go to the old house on West 98th Street. The house had been sold many years earlier, but the new owners agreed to let them visit. The room once prepared for Ethan had been remodeled, with no bassinet, toddler bed, or items Margaret had kept. The four stood in the small room. Margaret remembered where she had first placed Samuel in bed. Lucas remembered his childhood under the name Ethan. Matthew looked at the room that had been prepared for him, but where he had never lived. Lily stood beside her twin brother, the person she had once thought existed only in fragmented dreams. No one returned to their old place. Matthew could not go back to being a 2-day-old baby. Lucas could not erase more than 40 years of living in the Holloway family. Lily could not reclaim her childhood beside her twin brother. Margaret also could not reclaim Richard or the lost years, but for the first time, everyone knew who they truly were. That evening, they returned to Margaret's house and sat around a small table. Margaret sat between Matthew and Lucas, while Lily sat across from them. There were no reporters, police, or lawyers. Matthew still could not call Margaret mother. Lucas was still learning to live with his real name. Lily still used both names, Lily and Sarah. Margaret looked at the 3 people in front of her and said, "We cannot start over from the beginning. But we can start from here." No one answered immediately. Lucas poured more water for Lily. Matthew helped Margaret cut her food. The meal passed with hesitant stories, silences, and occasional laughter. It was not the perfect reunion Margaret had imagined for nearly half a century. But for the first time, she sat with the son she had lost, the son she had raised, and the twin sister who had been found, in a room where no one had to live under someone else's identity. After the Ethan Holloway case concluded, the investigation results not only changed the lives of those involved, but also prompted many law enforcement agencies across the United States to review how they handled missing persons cases that had lasted for decades. Starting in 2018, cold case units in Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York, and several neighboring states began re-examining closed cases of missing children where a child with similar appearance had been identified using old methods. Investigators were encouraged to use DNA and genetic genealogy to recheck cases where identity had never been confirmed by scientific evidence. Lucas Bennett's story proved that a mistaken identification could conceal 2 missing persons cases. One child placed into a family that was not his, while the real child continued to live under a different identity. In 2019, Lucas, Lily, and several families with missing relatives helped found the Identity Recovery Network, a nonprofit organization that supports adults who suspect their identity, birth certificate, or family origins. The program provides DNA testing, genealogy experts, psychological counseling, and legal support for families facing reunions after decades of separation. The founders understood that finding a missing person does not mean all trauma ends. A DNA result can return a real name, but can also break families, memories, and lifelong relationships. The case was also referenced in newborn security training programs. Many hospitals enhanced electronic identification bans, alarm systems when a child is taken from authorized areas, photo employee badges, and verification procedures before a newborn is allowed to leave the patient room. These measures could not change what happened to Ethan in 1968, but they became part of efforts to prevent other families from experiencing the same loss. For the survivors, reclaiming identity did not happen in a single day. Lucas officially took back the surname Bennett, but kept Holloway as a middle name, becoming Lucas Holloway Bennett to honor the family that had raised him for more than 40 years. Lily used the name Lily Sarah Bennett because she did not want to erase the woman named Sarah who had lived, worked, and built a family in West Virginia. Matthew chose the name Ethan Matthew Holloway. He accepted that he was the child abducted from Cleveland, but did not want to completely deny nearly 70 years lived under the name Matthew Porter. Margaret never called one her real child and the other her false child. For her, Ethan was the son she had given birth to and waited nearly half a century for, while Lucas was the son she had raised, loved, and watched grow up. DNA could determine blood ties, but it could not erase decades of love, responsibility, and memories. In her final years, Margaret spent time with both sons. She did not try to make up for nearly 50 lost years with Ethan by demanding he become the son she had once imagined. She also did not let Ethan's return make Lucas feel he no longer belonged to the Holloway family. Lily continued building a relationship with her twin brother through weekly phone calls, meetings, and the small memories both gradually recalled. None of them could reclaim the lost childhood. Richard could not come back to know his biological son had been found. Lucas and Lily could not return to the small room in Buffalo to grow up together. Ethan could not become the child raised by Richard and Margaret. Margaret also could not erase nearly half a century of waiting. The truth did not heal every wound and did not put life back on the path it should have taken. But the truth gave Lucas, Lily, and Ethan back their names, origins, and the right to decide which family they wanted to belong to. It gave Margaret the chance to know her son had never died, and gave those who had lived under false identities the right to look back at their lives with truth instead of fabricated records. The Ethan Holloway case was finally closed after nearly 50 years, but its meaning did not lie in the day Elaine Porter was convicted, or the day DNA confirmed the identities of the missing. It lay in the fact that people who had been turned into names on files had their own histories returned to them. Because a cold case is not just a dusty file in storage, a list of suspects, or an unsolved crime. Behind each of those files are families still waiting. Adults who may be living under a name that does not belong to them, and lives that have never truly been closed. Sometimes, the last thing the truth can return after decades is not the lost time, but a person's right to know who they are, where they came from, and to be called by their true name. If you love mysterious cold case stories and journeys in search of the truth, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next cases. Thank you for following the story until the final minute, and see you in the next video.